Section 1. You're in your kitchen at night, the house finally quiet, and your phone lights up with a message that isn't even accusing you, just heavy. I'm really disappointed. Your stomach drops anyway, like you've been caught doing something wrong. What if the reason you feel guilty when someone else is upset has less to do with empathy and more to do with a reflex you learned a long time ago? Because this isn't just being sensitive. This is the pattern where other people's moods become your problem the moment you notice them. A coworker sounds annoyed on Zoom and you instantly start overperforming. A friend goes cold in a group chat and you rush to patch things up. A partner is stressed after work and you start apologizing for things you didn't do, just to stop the tension from spreading through the room. You tell yourself you're keeping the peace, but what you're really doing is trading your calm for short-term relief. And the stakes are not small. At work, this turns into extra tasks you never agreed to, long replies you didn't need to write, and that constant pressure to be the easy one so nobody is disappointed in you. In money, it becomes covering the bill, sending the loan, picking up someone else's slack, because you can't tolerate the emotional discomfort of them being frustrated. In relationships, it makes you over-explain, over-apologize, and over-manage the emotional climate like you're responsible for everyone's experience. And if nothing changes, you keep paying for it with your time, your sleep, your focus, and your self-respect. You end up living as a mood manager instead of an adult with choices. By the end of today, you'll be able to separate what's actually yours to carry from what belongs to other adults. You'll know how to show up with empathy without trying to rescue people from their feelings. And you'll have practical ways to respond, calmly, clearly, and without that familiar guilt spiral when someone is upset near you. Educational content inspired by classical Stoic texts. Not medical, psychological, financial, or legal advice. If you want steady Stoic Focus lessons on emotional control, boundaries, and relationships every week, this is the channel for you. Stay with me until the very end, and while you're here, hit like, tap subscribe, and share your thoughts in the comments. Now let's get painfully honest about what's happening inside you. When someone is disappointed, irritated, or sad, you don't just notice it. You interpret it. Your mind treats it like a flashing warning light. Fix this now, or you'll lose something: approval, connection, safety, status, peace. Even if the person never asked you to fix it, you start moving. You start drafting the apology. You start replaying what you said. You start offering solutions. You start paying emotional rent for a house you don't even own. This episode is about boundaries, but not the loud, dramatic kind. Not the kind where you give speeches or cut people off. This is about the quiet boundary inside you that says, I can care about what you feel without taking responsibility for it. That one line is the difference between empathy and emotional ownership. Empathy says, I see you. Ownership says, I must repair you. And ownership is where your life gets heavy. You can usually tell you're in ownership mode by how fast you move. Your heart rate picks up. Your thoughts narrow. You feel urgency. You feel like waiting is dangerous. You feel like if you don't respond perfectly, the relationship, the team dynamic, or the atmosphere in the room will collapse. You might not even call it guilt yet. Sometimes it feels like pressure. Sometimes it feels like an obligation. Sometimes it feels like being the good person. But underneath, it's the same mechanism. You're using your behavior to control someone else's emotion so you can finally relax. The Stoics had a sharp way of framing this. They weren't saying, don't care. They were saying, don't confuse what's yours with what isn't. Your choices are yours. Your tone is yours. Your honesty is yours. Your patience is yours. But another adult's feelings, those are theirs. You can influence them, sure. You can support them. You can be considerate. But you cannot own them. And when you try, you become exhausted and resentful, even if you look kind on the outside. Here's the part most people miss. Carrying someone else's emotions doesn't actually protect the relationship long term. It teaches people that your comfort is always available for purchase. It teaches them that disappointment is a lever they can pull. It teaches your own nervous system that your peace is conditional, something you earn by keeping everyone happy. That's not love. That's a contract you never agreed to, and you're paying the monthly fee. So today, we're going to build a different internal contract, one that lets you stay human and warm without being emotionally recruited every time someone is upset. And we're going to do it without turning you into a robot, without making you cold, and without pretending you'll never feel guilt again. The goal isn't to delete guilt. The goal is to stop letting guilt drive. Here's the roadmap, and I'm going to keep it practical. First, we're going to tear apart the belief that if someone is upset, I must have done something wrong, and replace it with a cleaner truth you can live with. Next, you'll learn how to recognize guilt as a signal, not an order, so you can feel it without obeying it. Then we'll work on the simple language that keeps you out of overexplaining, because overexplaining is how you accidentally hand someone a steering wheel to your life. After that, you'll practice holding steady through the hardest part, the moment someone reacts to your boundary with disappointment, silence, or attitude. Finally, we'll put the tools together so you can handle real pressure, work pressure, family pressure, relationship pressure, without losing yourself. And I promised you something specific earlier, so I'm going to lock it in. In a bit, we're going to walk through a Friday night situation where someone you care about is clearly unhappy, and you'll feel that old pull to scramble and fix it. But instead, you'll use one sentence and one pause that changes the entire night. Not because you controlled their mood, because you finally stopped trying. Before we go there, notice what might be happening to you right now as you listen. If this hits close, there's a chance you're already thinking, but if I don't manage people's feelings, won't I be selfish? That's the fear. That's the old wiring. And it makes sense, because you've probably been rewarded for being the emotional sponge. You've probably been told you're mature, responsible, and considerate. You've probably been the person who calms the room. But being the person who calms the room is not the same thing as being free. Freedom is being able to sit in the presence of someone else's discomfort without panicking. Freedom is being able to respond without rushing. Freedom is being able to say, I hear you, without adding, and therefore I'll abandon my needs so you feel better. That's what we're building, a steadier version of you who can stay kind and still stay separate. And if you've never practiced this, it might feel weird at first. Your brain will call it rude. Your body will call it dangerous. Your guilt will try to negotiate. That doesn't mean you're wrong. It means you're learning a new skill, letting other adults have their emotions while you keep your center. So keep listening with that in mind. You're not trying to win an argument with yourself. You're learning a new way to carry life, lighter, cleaner, and more honest. And when we get to that Friday night moment later, you'll see why this matters, not just for being better at boundaries, but for reclaiming your evenings, your weekends, your attention, and that quiet feeling of self-respect that comes from living like your emotional life belongs to you. Section 2. The first boundary you have to rebuild isn't with other people. It's inside you. The instruction is simple, but uncomfortable. Stop treating guilt as a command. Because if you don't, guilt will keep deciding your behavior faster than your values ever get a chance to speak. The stakes are real here. When guilt runs the show, you say yes when you mean no, explain when silence would be enough, and carry emotional weight that quietly drains your focus and energy day after day. Here's why this works. Guilt feels urgent, but it isn't intelligent. It's an emotion designed to signal potential social risk, not to give you accurate instructions. Your body learned, often early, that guilt meant danger, loss of approval, tension, disconnection. So now, whenever someone around you is upset, guilt fires like an alarm and pushes you to act immediately. But an alarm isn't a plan. An alarm just tells you something might matter. The calmer, more focused version of you doesn't obey the alarm. They pause, assess, and choose. There's one sentence you're going to start using internally when guilt shows up. Say it exactly like this: I'm allowed to feel guilt without letting it decide. That's it. No arguing with the feeling. No trying to make it disappear. You're just removing its authority. Let's put this into a concrete, everyday moment. You're at work on a Wednesday afternoon. A teammate messages you on Slack, "Hey, I'm really stressed about this deadline." Immediately, you feel that familiar pull. Your chest tightens. You start thinking about staying late, even though this task isn't yours. The old reaction is automatic. You jump in, reassure them, take on extra work, and silently resent it later. This time, you pause. You read the message again. You say the sentence in your head, "I'm allowed to feel guilt without letting it decide." You still care. So you respond calmly, you acknowledge their stress, but you don't volunteer yourself as the solution. You offer what's actually yours to give with clarity, maybe a small assist, without absorbing their panic. The tension doesn't vanish instantly, but something important happens. You don't lose your evening. You don't spiral. You don't feel secretly used. Here's a tiny action you can take today. Pick one situation where you usually act out of guilt, one person, one pattern. Decide in advance that when guilt shows up there, you will wait 10 minutes before responding. That's it. 10 minutes. You're not deciding what you'll say yet. You're just creating space so guilt doesn't get first access to your behavior. Let's slow this down for a moment. Right now, take a slow breath in through your nose. Hold it briefly. Then let it out longer than you breathed in. Do that once more. As you breathe, notice that guilt is just a sensation, tightness, pressure, warmth. It's uncomfortable, but it's survivable. Say the sentence quietly to yourself once, "I'm allowed to feel guilt without letting it decide." Then say it again, slower, so your body hears it too. What usually keeps people stuck is the belief that guilt is proof they're doing something wrong. But guilt is not a verdict. It's a feeling shaped by past reinforcement. If you were praised for being accommodating, guilt will flare when you stop accommodating. If you were punished for disappointing others, guilt will scream when you hold your line. That doesn't mean you're selfish. It means your nervous system hasn't updated yet. Notice how this changes your identity in small ways. You're no longer the person who reacts fastest to emotional pressure. You're the person who can tolerate a little discomfort without collapsing into action. That's not indifference. That's maturity. And it's what allows real empathy to exist, because empathy without choice turns into obligation. You might be thinking, but what if they really need me? That's where clarity comes in later. This step isn't about never helping. It's about choosing to help instead of being hijacked into it. When guilt decides, your help comes with resentment. When you decide, your help comes clean. Here's another everyday example. A family member calls you and sounds irritated. They start venting, and you feel that old responsibility creeping in. The old you would apologize, justify, or rush to calm them down. This time, you listen. You feel the guilt rise. You don't interrupt it or obey it. You remind yourself you're allowed to feel it. You stay present without trying to fix it. The conversation ends without a dramatic resolution, but you don't carry it into the rest of your night. That's the win. This skill doesn't make guilt disappear overnight. It retrains your response to it. Each time you pause instead of pouncing, you teach your system that discomfort isn't an emergency. Over time, guilt softens because it stops getting rewarded with instant action. One more slow practice before we move on. Bring to mind one recent moment where guilt pushed you into something you didn't actually want to do. See it clearly. Now imagine that same moment, but with a pause inserted before your response. No rewrite of the outcome yet, just the pause. Let your body feel what that pause would have been like. Uncomfortable, yes. But also steadier. Hold on to this distinction as we continue. Guilt is information, not instruction. And if you don't learn to separate the two, you'll keep living as if everyone else's emotions outrank your own judgment. In the next part, we're going to build on this by looking at why overexplaining feels so tempting and how it quietly hands your power away right after guilt gets your attention. Section 3. The next shift is deceptively small, but it changes everything once guilt has already been triggered. The instruction is this: stop overexplaining your boundaries. Because the moment you start justifying, defending, or narrating your inner process, you quietly hand the other person control over whether your boundary is acceptable. If this never changes, you stay stuck negotiating your adulthood with people who don't actually get a vote. Here's why this works. Overexplaining feels polite, but it's usually driven by anxiety. When guilt flares, your brain tries to reduce it by getting agreement. You explain so the other person won't be upset. You add context so they won't misunderstand. You pile on reasons so they'll approve. But the hidden message underneath all that explanation is, if you don't accept this, I might have to change it. A calmer, more grounded version of you doesn't need permission to choose how you use your time and energy. They give information, not arguments. There's a single sentence you can start using that interrupts this pattern immediately. Say it like this, and don't embellish it. That doesn't work for me right now. Notice what's missing. No apology. No backstory. No resume of your good intentions. Just clarity. You're not being rude. You're being complete. Let's put this into a real scene. You're messaging with a friend who wants to make last-minute plans on a weeknight. You're exhausted. You've already had a long day. The old reaction shows up fast. You type, delete, retype. You start explaining how busy work has been, how you haven't been sleeping well, how you'd love to but you really can't, how maybe another time would be better. The more you explain, the more you feel exposed. Now there's room for negotiation. They push back. You feel worse. This time, you pause. You let the guilt be there. You send one sentence, that doesn't work for me right now. They might respond with disappointment. They might go quiet. And you don't rush to fix either one. You don't chase them with another message. You don't soften it with an apology parade. You hold. What usually surprises people is that most situations don't escalate when you stop over-explaining. They clarify. Over-explaining is what turns a simple no into a debate. It invites the other person to weigh your reasons, rank them, or solve them. When you remove the reasons, there's nothing to argue with. There's just a reality. Here's a tiny action you can take today. Identify one recurring situation where you habitually over-explain, declining invitations, pushing back at work, setting limits with family. Write one clean sentence you can use there. Not a paragraph. One sentence. Save it in your phone if you need to. The goal isn't to sound clever. It's to sound finished. Let's slow this down so your body can catch up. Right now, take a breath in. Let it fill your chest. Exhale slowly. As you breathe out, imagine saying your one sentence and then stopping. No follow-up. No justification. Notice the discomfort that comes up. That discomfort is the old pattern losing its grip. Say the sentence once, quietly. Then again, a little slower. Let your nervous system learn that nothing terrible happens when you stop talking. What keeps people locked in over-explaining is the fear of being seen as selfish or uncaring. But clarity isn't cruelty. In fact, unclear boundaries are what breed resentment. When you explain too much and then cave, you teach others that persistence works. When you explain too much and hold firm, you exhaust yourself unnecessarily. Clear boundaries, delivered without excess, are actually kinder because they don't create false hope. You'll notice something else too. When you stop over-explaining, people reveal how they relate to boundaries. Some respect them immediately. Some push. Some sulk. None of those reactions mean you did something wrong. They're information. And information is only useful if you don't rush to fix it. Here's another everyday example. A manager asks if you can just quickly take on a task outside your scope. The old you might say yes while explaining how busy you are, hoping they'll appreciate the sacrifice. Or you might say no, but with a long justification that invites pressure. This time, you respond calmly, I don't have capacity for that this week. You don't add sorry. You don't list your workload. You let the sentence land. If they ask for a follow-up, you answer only what's asked. You stay in information mode, not defense mode. You leave the conversation without that familiar tightness in your chest. There's an identity shift happening here, and it's subtle. You're moving from being someone who needs to be understood to be okay, to someone who can be misunderstood and still steady. That's not arrogance. That's emotional adulthood. As Marcus notes in Meditations 5.20, your peace depends on keeping your judgments aligned with what's actually in your control. Other people's interpretations are not. Another slow practice before we move on. Think of one boundary you've been rehearsing in your head but haven't said yet. Notice how many explanations you've been attaching to it. Now mentally strip it down to the simplest true sentence. Sit with that version. Let the urge to add more rise and fall without acting on it. That's you practicing restraint, not silence, but precision. Over time, this changes how people experience you. You become easier to understand, not harder. Your yes means yes. Your no means no. And because you're not leaking anxiety through explanation, interactions feel cleaner. You spend less time replaying conversations. You recover faster when someone is disappointed. You start trusting yourself more because you're no longer bargaining with your own limits. Hold on to this idea as we continue. Guilt may light the spark, but overexplaining pours fuel on it. When you remove the fuel, the fire dies down on its own. In the next part, we're going to focus on what happens when someone doesn't like your boundary and how to stay steady without backtracking when the discomfort shows up. Section 4. Here's where most people break. Not when they set the boundary, but when the other person reacts to it. The instruction here is steady and specific. Do not rush to soothe disappointment. Because the moment you try to smooth over someone else's reaction, you silently undo the boundary you just set. If this never changes, every limit you draw will collapse the second it's tested. This works because disappointment is often the real trigger, not the request itself. You can say no calmly. You can be clear. And then the other person sighs, goes quiet, sounds hurt, or acts irritated. That's when guilt spikes again. Your body reads their reaction as danger. Your mind fills in the story, I've hurt them, I'm being unfair, I need to make this better. So you rush back in with reassurance, extra explanation, or concessions. A steadier version of you understands something crucial: disappointment is an emotion, not a verdict. Someone feeling unhappy does not mean you've done something wrong. There's a sentence you'll need in moments like this. It's short, and it's internal. Say it exactly like this: I can let this be uncomfortable without fixing it. This isn't about being cold. It's about giving discomfort time to pass without interfering. Picture a common situation. You tell a friend you can't help them move this weekend. You're already stretched thin. They pause, then say, "Oh. Okay." The tone shifts. Silence hangs there. The old reaction floods in. You start scrambling. Maybe you offer to help for a few hours. Maybe you apologize again. Maybe you start explaining how bad you feel. This time, you stop. You notice the discomfort in your chest. You say the sentence to yourself, I can let this be uncomfortable without fixing it. You stay quiet. You don't pile on reassurance. The moment passes. The conversation ends a little awkwardly, but your boundary remains intact. And later, you realize something important: the world didn't end. Here's why this matters so much. When you rush to soothe disappointment, you teach others that your boundaries are negotiable through emotion. Not necessarily on purpose, but functionally. Disappointment becomes leverage. Silence becomes pressure. And you become responsible not just for your actions, but for managing everyone else's reactions to them. That's an impossible job. Here's a tiny action you can take today. The next time someone reacts to your boundary with disappointment, count to 5 before responding, out loud if you need to. Not to plan what to say. Just to not fix it. 5 seconds is often enough to break the reflex. If you do speak, let it be minimal and calm. No emotional cleanup. Let's slow this down together for a moment. Take a breath in. Feel your shoulders rise slightly. Exhale slowly and let them drop. Notice how discomfort wants movement. It wants you to do something. And yet, right now, nothing is required. Say the sentence once, I can let this be uncomfortable without fixing it. Say it again, slower. Let your body register that you're safe even when someone else isn't pleased. A lot of people worry this will make them uncaring. But there's a difference between empathy and emotional labor. Empathy is acknowledging someone's feelings. Emotional labor is taking responsibility for resolving it. You can say, I hear that you're disappointed, without saying, so I'll change my boundary. One respects both people. The other erases you. Here's another everyday example. At work, you decline an extra project. Your manager responds with visible frustration. Maybe they sigh. Maybe they say, well, that's disappointing. The old you would immediately soften, offering to stay late another night, apologizing repeatedly, trying to repair the mood. This time, you stay grounded. You acknowledge the emotion without owning it. You might say, I understand this isn't ideal, and then stop. You don't justify. You don't counterattack. You let their feelings be theirs. The meeting ends tense, but clean. And later, you're not replaying it for hours. What actually happens when you don't fix disappointment is revealing. Sometimes the other person regulates themselves. Sometimes they adjust their expectations. Sometimes they show you they're not comfortable with boundaries at all. None of those outcomes are failures. They're information. And you can only receive information if you stop interfering with it. There's also a timing shift that matters here. Disappointment often peaks quickly and fades if it's not reinforced. When you rush to soothe, you keep it alive. You prolong the moment. When you hold steady, it usually passes faster than you expect. Your nervous system just hasn't learned that yet. Another slow practice before we move on. Bring to mind a recent moment where someone reacted poorly to a boundary you set or wanted to set. Notice where you felt it in your body. Now imagine yourself staying quiet for 5 seconds longer than you did. Just 5. Let yourself feel the discomfort without changing anything. That imagined pause is training. It's you rehearsing steadiness. There's an identity shift happening here too. You're moving from I need everyone to be okay with me to I can be okay even if someone else isn't. That shift doesn't make you selfish. It makes you resilient. And resilience is what allows long-term kindness instead of short-term appeasement. As Seneca hints in his letters to Lucilius, much of our distress comes from trying to control outcomes that aren't ours to command. Other people's reactions fall squarely into that category. When you stop wrestling with them, you free up enormous mental space. Carry this forward. Boundaries don't fail when someone reacts emotionally. They fail when you retreat from them to relieve your own discomfort. In the next part, we're going to look at a pattern that often shows up right after disappointment, the urge to re-engage mentally and replay the conversation, and how to end it so it doesn't steal the rest of your day. Section 5. Even when you hold the boundary and survive the disappointment, there's another place people lose hours of their lives, inside their own head. The instruction here is clear and necessary: end the conversation internally when it's over externally. Because if you don't, the interaction keeps draining you long after it's finished. The stakes are quiet but serious. You lose evenings to replay. You lose focus to imaginary rebuttals. You lose sleep to conversations that are already done. Here's why this works. Your brain is a problem-solving machine. When something feels unresolved or emotionally charged, it keeps looping, searching for a better outcome. That loop used to serve a purpose: learning from mistakes, avoiding danger. But in modern life, it often misfires. You replay not to solve anything, but to soothe discomfort. And ironically, the replay keeps the discomfort alive. A calmer, more focused version of you knows that closure is often a decision, not a mutual agreement. There's one internal sentence that matters here. Say it exactly like this: this conversation is over, even if it didn't feel good. That's not denial. It's containment. You're not pretending it was perfect. You're deciding not to live inside it anymore. Let's look at a familiar scene. You set a boundary with someone. Maybe you said no. Maybe you didn't overexplain. Maybe you didn't rush to fix their disappointment. The interaction ends awkwardly. Later that night, you're brushing your teeth or lying in bed, and your mind lights up. You replay their tone. You imagine what you should have said. You draft imaginary follow-up texts that explain you better, soften the edge, and make you look kinder. The old reaction is to stay in that loop, convincing yourself you're processing. This time, you notice what's happening. You say the sentence, "This conversation is over," even if it didn't feel good. And when your mind tries to restart it, you repeat the sentence and redirect your attention back to what's actually in front of you. Here's the key insight most people miss. Mental re-engagement is still engagement. Even if the other person is asleep, even if they've moved on, you're still in the exchange. You're donating time and energy to a situation that no longer needs your participation. Ending the conversation internally is how you reclaim that energy. Here's a tiny action you can take today. Pick one recurring mental replay you tend to have, one person, one scenario. Decide in advance what your closing line will be. Not to send. To think. Something simple like, "I've decided how I feel about this," or "This doesn't need more airtime." Use the same line every time the replay starts. Consistency is what trains your mind. Let's slow this down so it lands in your body. Take a breath in. Let it be natural. As you exhale, imagine mentally placing the conversation on a shelf and stepping back. You're not throwing it away. You're just not holding it anymore. Say the sentence once, "This conversation is over," even if it didn't feel good. Say it again, slower. Feel how your shoulders drop a fraction when you stop rehearsing. People often worry that ending the conversation internally means they won't learn from it. But learning doesn't require rumination. Learning requires clarity. You can reflect once, extract the lesson, and then stop. Replaying the same moment 20 times doesn't deepen insight. It deepens grooves. Here's another everyday example. A coworker reacts poorly when you don't take on extra work. You leave the office, but the interaction follows you home. You replay it while cooking. You replay it while scrolling. You replay it while trying to sleep. This time, you notice the pattern early. You tell yourself the conversation is over. You redirect your attention to something physical, your feet on the floor, the sound of running water, the rhythm of your breathing. Each redirect is not avoidance. It's discipline. There's an identity shift here too. You're becoming someone who doesn't need emotional resolution to move on. You don't need the other person to agree. You don't need to feel perfectly understood. You need to be clear with yourself. That's enough. As Marcus observes in Meditations 4.49, peace comes from doing what's in front of you well, not from rehearsing what's already past. Another slow practice before we move on. Bring to mind a conversation you tend to replay. Notice the exact moment your mind hooks into it. Now imagine inserting your closing line right there. See the replay stop, not because it's forbidden, but because it's finished. Sit with the quiet that follows. That quiet can feel strange at first. Your mind is used to noise. But that quiet is where your attention returns. Ending conversations internally also protects your boundaries retroactively. When you replay and self-criticize, you undermine yourself after the fact. You erode confidence. When you close the loop, you reinforce the boundary you already held. You teach yourself, "I can trust my decisions even when they're uncomfortable." This doesn't mean you'll never revisit a situation. It means you choose when and how. Reflection on your terms is different from rumination on your nerves' terms. One builds wisdom. The other burns energy. Carry this forward. Setting a boundary is one moment. Holding it through disappointment is another. But reclaiming your mind afterward is what makes the change stick. If you don't, the old pattern sneaks back in through the side door, draining you quietly while telling you it's just thinking. In the next part, we're going to look at one of the deepest traps people fall into after all this progress, getting pulled back into old family or role-based dynamics that trigger guilt automatically, and how simply refusing to step into the role weakens the entire pattern without confrontation. Section 6. The next boundary is harder because it doesn't start in the present. It starts in the past. The instruction here is this: stop stepping back into roles you've already outgrown. Because the moment you do, guilt turns automatic and your boundaries collapse without a word being spoken. If this never changes, you'll keep reacting like an earlier version of yourself no matter how much insight you have now. Here's why this works. Roles are shortcuts. Families, teams, and social groups unconsciously assign them to keep things predictable. You become the responsible one, the peacemaker, the fixer, the one who doesn't make trouble. These roles aren't evil. They're efficient. But they're also sticky. Once a role exists, people interact with you based on it rather than who you are now. And when you step back into the role, your body follows old rules before your mind can intervene. A calmer, more grounded version of you recognizes that roles only function if you keep playing them. There's one internal sentence that interrupts this immediately. Say it exactly like this: I don't have to perform my old role to belong. That sentence isn't about rebellion. It's about reality. You're allowed to update how you show up without announcing it. Let's make this concrete. You're with family, maybe on a call or at a gathering. Someone makes a comment that subtly expects you to manage the mood, smooth the tension, or take responsibility. Maybe it's a sigh. Maybe it's a joke. Maybe it's a look. The old reaction is instant. You feel that familiar pressure in your chest. You start adjusting yourself, your tone, your words, your energy, to keep things comfortable. This time, you notice the pull. You say the sentence internally: I don't have to perform my old role to belong. And then you don't jump in. You don't rescue the moment. You let the silence exist. The dynamic feels strange, but something important happens. The role weakens. Here's the key insight: roles don't disappear through confrontation. They disappear through non-participation. You don't need to explain that you're no longer the fixer. You don't need to announce boundaries. You simply stop performing the function. Over time, the system recalibrates or reveals where it can't. Here's a tiny action you can take today. Identify one role you reliably fall into with a specific person or group. Just one. Decide in advance one behavior you will not do next time: no fixing, no smoothing, and no mediating. You're not deciding what you will do instead yet. You're just choosing what you're done doing. Let's slow this down for a moment so your nervous system doesn't panic. Take a slow breath in. Let it expand your ribs. Exhale and feel your body settle into the chair. As you breathe out, imagine staying in the room without performing. No fixing. No managing. Just presence. Say the sentence once: I don't have to perform my old role to belong. Say it again, slower. Let your body learn that belonging doesn't require effort. People often fear that stepping out of a role will cause rejection. Sometimes it does create friction. But more often, it creates space. Others step up. Or the dynamic becomes more honest. Or you finally see which relationships were built on your labor rather than mutual respect. None of that is comfortable, but all of it is clarifying. Here's another everyday example. At work, you're known as the person who always picks up slack. A deadline approaches. Someone drops the ball. The old role activates. You feel obligated to save the project. This time, you pause. You let the role impulse pass. You do your part, and no more. You don't announce your change. You just don't overfunction. The team feels the gap. That gap isn't a failure. It's information. Notice what happens inside you when you don't perform. Guilt shows up again, but it's different. It's role-based guilt, not value-based guilt. It says, this isn't how I'm supposed to be. That's the signal you're exiting an outdated identity. You don't need to argue with that feeling. You just need to not obey it. There's an identity shift happening here that's deeper than any single boundary. You're moving from conditional belonging to grounded belonging. Conditional belonging says, I'm accepted if I manage everyone else. Grounded belonging says, I'm allowed to exist without managing the room. That shift is subtle, but it changes how much emotional energy you leak every day. Another slow practice before we move on. Think of one environment where you reliably shrink into a role. See yourself entering it. Notice the urge to perform. Now imagine yourself staying physically relaxed, shoulders down, jaw loose, while doing less than usual. Let the discomfort rise and fall without action. That imagined restraint is practice. It trains your system to tolerate being undefined. This also protects you from resentment. Roles create invisible contracts. You keep doing the thing. Others keep expecting it. When you finally burn out, everyone's confused. By stepping out earlier, you prevent that slow emotional debt from accumulating. You might wonder if this will make you less useful or less valued. In the short term, it can feel that way. In the long term, it makes your yes meaningful. When you do help, it's chosen. When you step in, it's intentional. And that's the difference between contribution and self-erasure. Carry this forward. You are not required to be who you were to remain connected. Roles survive on repetition, not truth. When you stop repeating them, they loosen their grip. In the next part, we're going to address what often follows this step, the surge of guilt that tries to pull you back the moment you feel you've disappointed someone, and how to let that guilt exist without collapsing your boundary or your sense of self. Section 7. There's a moment that comes after you set the boundary, after you hold steady through disappointment, after you stop overexplaining, after you refuse the old role, and it's the most deceptive part of all. The instruction here is precise: let guilt exist without negotiating with it. Because guilt will make one last attempt to pull you back, not with urgency this time, but with reason. If this never changes, you'll keep collapsing your boundaries days later, long after the original moment passed, and you'll never understand why you feel so tired. Here's why this works. Guilt doesn't always shout. Sometimes it waits. It shows up later when you're alone and your guard is down. It comes in the form of being thoughtful. It sounds like maturity. It sounds like kindness. It sounds like, maybe I should follow up, or maybe I was too blunt, or it wouldn't hurt to explain myself one more time. But most of the time, this isn't clear. This is delayed compliance. Your nervous system is still trying to restore the old balance by undoing what you did earlier. A steadier version of you learns to recognize that move and refuses to engage. There's one sentence you'll need when guilt circles back like this. It's internal, and it's final. Say it exactly like this: I don't need to revisit this to be a good person. That line draws a clean boundary between reflection and self-betrayal. It doesn't make you perfect. It makes you consistent. Let's look at how this plays out in real life. You set a boundary earlier in the week. Maybe you said no to an invitation. Maybe you didn't rescue someone from their disappointment. Maybe you didn't absorb a coworker's stress. At the time, you felt shaky but proud. Then a day or two passes. You're doing something normal, driving home, folding laundry, brushing your teeth, and guilt resurfaces. Not intense. Reasonable. And that's what makes it dangerous. You start drafting a message in your head that will soften the situation. You tell yourself it's about kindness, not fear. The old reaction is to reopen the door and renegotiate your boundaries so the discomfort stops. This time, you pause. You notice the timing. You say the sentence, I don't need to revisit this to be a good person. And you don't send anything. You let the urge crest and fall. This matters because guilt often survives boundaries by switching strategies. When urgency fails, it tries persuasion. When persuasion fails, it tries identity. It asks, what kind of person would you be if you don't fix this? That question feels heavy because you care about being decent. But decency doesn't require constant self-correction. Decency requires integrity, being the same person in private that you were in the moment you chose your boundary. Here's the psychological trap in plain language. Your brain associates relief with action. You feel guilt, you do something, and the guilt drops. That teaches your system, guilt equals command. But it's the same mechanism as scratching an itch. Scratching feels good for a moment, but it reinforces the itch. Every time you fix guilt by renegotiating, you train your mind to produce more guilt next time, because it works. The way out is to stop rewarding guilt with action. There's another layer to this too. You may have learned that goodness equals emotional labor. That if you're truly kind, you'll always smooth things out. You'll always be available. You'll always make it right. But that belief quietly turns you into a person who can't rest. You can't relax in relationships because you're always scanning for unfinished emotional business. You can't feel proud of growth because growth creates friction, and friction triggers guilt. So you keep sliding back into old behavior to relieve the pressure. And then you wonder why your boundaries never stick. Here's a tiny action you can take today that makes this practical. Choose one boundary you've recently set or plan to set. Decide on a no follow-up rule for 72 hours. 3 days. During that time, you do not send any additional message to soften, explain, or reassure unless there's a true logistical need. Not emotional cleanup. Logistics only. This gives your nervous system time to learn that discomfort fades without you doing anything. If you want something even simpler, do this. When you feel the urge to follow up, write the message in your Notes app, but do not send it. Then close the app. That's you meeting the urge without obeying it. You'll be amazed how often, an hour later, the message no longer feels necessary. Let's slow this down so it lands in your body, not just your head. Take a breath in through your nose. Hold it for a brief beat. Exhale longer than you inhaled. Do that once more. As you breathe out, notice how guilt tries to push you forward into motion. Now say the sentence once, I don't need to revisit this to be a good person. And say it again, slower. Let your body feel what it's like to remain still while guilt moves through you. Now, a lot of people hear this and worry, but what if I actually was too harsh? Good question. This is where you learn the difference between guilt and values. Values-based reflection feels calm and specific. It says, next time, I'll speak more gently, or I could have been clearer. It doesn't feel frantic. It doesn't feel like you're trying to win back approval. Guilt-based renegotiation feels restless and vague. It says, I should fix it, without knowing what it is. It's not about improving. It's about soothing. So here's a practical test. If you're truly reflecting, you can wait. You can sleep on it. You can revisit it later with a clear mind. If you feel like you must act right now to stop the discomfort, that's guilt trying to regain control. And you don't have to obey it. Let's run another everyday example. You told a family member you couldn't attend an event. They accepted it, but without warmth. Days later, guilt nudges you to call and explain more, or offer a compromise you don't actually want. Maybe I can swing by for an hour, even though you know it will turn into 3 hours and you'll be drained. This time, you don't. You remind yourself you already communicated. You let their feelings be theirs. You keep your plan. The relationship survives. More importantly, your self-trust survives. Or imagine this with money. A friend hints they're short on rent. You feel guilty because you have some savings, even though you're trying to pay down debt. You say no, or you say you can't help this month. Then, later, guilt revisits you. If I'm a good friend, I should sacrifice. This is where you use your line. I don't need to revisit this to be a good person. You're not judging them. You're protecting your reality. You can still be kind in other ways, sharing resources, helping them brainstorm options, without breaking your own financial boundaries to buy relief. There's an identity shift here, and it's subtle but powerful. You're becoming someone who doesn't need emotional relief to validate their choices. You're allowing discomfort to exist without treating it as a problem to solve. That's a form of strength that's quiet and durable. It's the difference between being nice and being trustworthy to yourself. Another slow practice before we move on. Bring to mind a boundary you're tempted to reopen. Feel the urge to send that message, that apology, that softener. Now imagine you don't do it. Imagine you make tea instead. Or you take a shower. Or you walk around the block. Let the urge ride along with you like background noise. Notice that the urge changes intensity. It rises. It falls. It moves. That's the lesson. Urges are waves, not commands. And one more thing, this step is what prevents you from swinging to emotional distance. When you stop renegotiating, you might fear you're becoming cold. But you're not. You're becoming clean. Clean kindness doesn't require self-erasure. Clean kindness can say, I care, without adding, and I'll undo my boundaries so you feel better. Carry this forward. Boundaries don't just need to be set and held. They need to be left alone. Guilt will test them quietly later when you're tired, reflective, or alone. When you learn to let guilt exist without renegotiation, your boundaries finally settle into place. In the next part, we're going to build on this by showing how to stay empathetic without slipping back into emotional responsibility, so you don't swing from overcarrying everyone to shutting down and calling it boundaries. Section 8. The final core skill ties everything together, because this is where many people swing too far in the opposite direction. The instruction here is balanced and precise. Practice empathy without emotional responsibility. Because if you don't learn this distinction, you'll either keep overcarrying everyone, or you'll shut down and call it boundaries. Neither one gives you the life you're trying to build. Here's why this works. Empathy is the ability to recognize and acknowledge someone else's emotional state. Emotional responsibility is the belief that you must manage, reduce, or resolve that state. They feel similar in your body at first, which is why they get confused. Both involve attention. Both involve care. But only one of them drains you. A calmer, more grounded version of you can say, I see this, without saying, I must fix this. There's one sentence that anchors this distinction in real time. You'll use it externally sometimes, but more often internally. Say it exactly like this, I can care without carrying. That sentence keeps your heart open and your shoulders light at the same time. Let's slow down and make this concrete. Imagine someone close to you is clearly upset. Maybe they're venting. Maybe they're frustrated with work, money, or another relationship. The old pattern activates immediately. You listen, but your body starts gearing up to solve it. You offer suggestions too fast. You interrupt with fixes. You take responsibility for their relief. And if they don't calm down, you feel like you failed. This time, you do something different. You listen. You acknowledge. You reflect back what you hear. And then, you stop. You don't add solutions unless they're asked for. You don't rush the emotion out of the room. You let it exist without trying to move it. Here's why that matters. Emotions often need witnessing, not correction. When you rush to fix, you're not actually being more caring, you're being more controlling. You're trying to move the emotion away from you because it makes you uncomfortable. When you stay present without carrying it, you allow the other person to process their own experience. And you remain intact. Let's walk through a clear example. A partner comes home stressed and starts talking about their day. Their tone is sharp. The room feels tense. The old reaction kicks in. You apologize for things that have nothing to do with the situation. You start offering advice they didn't ask for. You feel responsible for turning the evening around. This time, you pause. You remember the sentence, I can care without carrying. You say something simple like, that sounds really frustrating. And then you stop talking. You stay engaged, but you don't take over. The emotion moves through them instead of into you. The night doesn't magically become cheerful, but it doesn't collapse either. And later, you don't feel drained or resentful. Here's a tiny action you can take today to practice this. In your next emotionally charged conversation, limit yourself to acknowledgement only for the first minute. No advice. No fixing. Just reflect what you hear. If the urge to solve rises, notice it and don't act on it yet. That minute is often enough to break the habit. Let's slow this down in your body, because this is where most people struggle. Take a breath in. Feel your chest expand. As you exhale, imagine letting the other person's emotion stay on their side of an invisible line. You're close. You're attentive. But you're not absorbing it. Say the sentence once, I can care without carrying. Say it again, slower. Let your body feel the difference between presence and responsibility. A lot of people worry this will make them passive or unhelpful. But there's a difference between support and rescue. Support says, I'm here. Rescue says, I'll take this from you. Rescue feels generous, but it creates dependence and resentment. Support builds strength, both yours and theirs. Here's another everyday example. A coworker vents about being overwhelmed. The old you might immediately offer to take tasks off their plate, even if you're already stretched. This time, you listen. You acknowledge. You might say, that sounds like a lot, and then you wait. If they ask for help, you decide what you can genuinely offer. If they don't, you let the conversation end without inserting yourself as the solution. You leave without that familiar heaviness in your chest. There's an identity shift happening here that's important. You're moving from I prove I care by fixing to I show I care by staying present. That shift is subtle, but it's the difference between emotional burnout and sustainable connection. It allows you to be consistent instead of intense. Notice how this connects to everything you've already practiced. You're no longer obeying guilt immediately. You're not overexplaining your limits. You're not rushing to soothe disappointment. You're not replaying the conversation afterward. You're not stepping into old roles. And now, you're not confusing empathy with obligation. Each piece supports the others. Another slow practice before we move on. Think of one person whose emotions you tend to carry. Picture a recent interaction with them. Now imagine the same interaction where you stay attentive but physically relaxed, jaw unclenched, shoulders down, breath steady. You listen. You acknowledge. And you stop. Let the image settle. That's what regulated empathy looks like. You may notice resistance here. Part of you might think, but if I don't carry it, who will? That belief often comes from being the emotional glue for a long time. But other adults don't need you to carry their feelings in order to have them. In fact, when you stop carrying, you often give them space to step into their own regulation. This also protects you from emotional distance. Some people, after learning boundaries, swing hard into detachment. They listen less. They care less. They call it peace. But it's actually armor. What you're building here is not armor. It's capacity. You can stay open without being flooded. There's a quiet confidence that comes with this. You don't brace when someone is upset. You don't disappear. You don't overperform. You stay. And staying, without fixing, is often the most respectful thing you can do. As a final reflection for this section, notice how your body feels when you imagine caring without carrying. There's likely still some discomfort, but there's also more space. More air. More choice. That's the feeling of emotional weight redistributing itself back where it belongs. Hold on to this. In the next part, we're going to put multiple tools together under real pressure, in a single, realistic situation, so you can feel how all of this works when it actually counts, when the old patterns almost take over, and you choose differently anyway. Section 9. It's Friday evening, and you're just getting home. The week has been long, the kind that leaves a low hum of fatigue in your body. You drop your bag by the door, loosen your shoes, and tell yourself you're going to have a quiet night. Nothing ambitious. Just dinner, maybe a show, and early sleep. Then your phone buzzes. It's a message from someone you care about. Not angry. Not dramatic. Just heavy. I guess I'll figure something else out then. You know exactly what that tone means. Disappointment. And instantly, the familiar pull starts. Your chest tightens. Your mind speeds up. You replay the earlier conversation where you said you couldn't make it tonight. You feel that old reflex, fix this before the night is ruined. This is the Friday night moment we teased earlier. The old version of you would already be typing. An explanation. A softener. A compromise you don't actually want. Maybe you'd offer to show up late. Maybe you'd apologize again. Maybe you'd cancel your own plans to restore the emotional balance. You'd tell yourself you're being kind. But by Sunday, you'd feel drained and quietly resentful, wondering why you never get a real break. This time, something different happens. You notice the urge instead of obeying it. You feel the guilt rise, but you remember the distinction you practiced earlier. Guilt is here, but it doesn't get to decide. You put the phone down on the counter and pause. Just for a moment. You take a slow breath in, then let it out longer than you breathed in. Your shoulders drop slightly. You remind yourself, silently, I'm allowed to feel guilt without letting it decide. Your mind tries another angle. It starts offering reasons. Maybe I was too blunt. Maybe I should explain more. You catch that too. Overexplaining has always been your way back into trouble. You don't need to justify your adulthood. You already said what you needed to say. The boundary was clear. You tell yourself, that doesn't need more explanation. The phone buzzes again. No new message, just your own nerves buzzing. You feel the discomfort peak. This is the moment where disappointment usually hooks you. Where you rush to soothe. Where you try to manage how the other person feels so you can finally relax. Instead, you let the discomfort sit there. You say the sentence quietly in your head, I can let this be uncomfortable without fixing it. And for the first time in a long while, you actually do. A minute passes. Then another. The urge to respond starts to soften, not disappear, but loosen. You realize something surprising, you're still okay. The room hasn't collapsed. The relationship hasn't exploded. You're standing in your kitchen, breathing, present. Eventually, you pick up the phone, not to renegotiate, not to explain, not to rescue, but to respond with empathy without responsibility. You type one simple line, I hear that you're disappointed. And you stop. No follow-up. No apology spiral. No compromise. You set the phone down again. There's a flicker of anxiety as you wait. Part of you expects backlash. Or silence that feels like punishment. But what happens instead is quieter. A few minutes later, a reply comes in. Yeah. I am. But I get it. That's it. No drama. No collapse. Just a human reaction that didn't need you to carry it. You feel something unfamiliar spread through you, not relief exactly, but steadiness. Later that night, as you cook dinner, your mind tries to replay the exchange. This used to be where you'd lose hours, rehashing every word. But you catch it early. You tell yourself, this conversation is over, even if it didn't feel good. You bring your attention back to the sound of the pan, the smell of food, the fact that it's finally the weekend. The loop doesn't vanish instantly, but it doesn't trap you either. Each time it tries to restart, you gently close it again. No punishment. No analysis. Just containment. At one point, another thought surfaces, the sneakiest one of all. Maybe I should check in tomorrow. Just to make sure everything's okay. You recognize it now for what it is, delayed guilt, trying one last time to regain control. You pause. You feel it in your chest. You don't argue with it. You don't obey it. You say the sentence you practiced, "I don't need to revisit this to be a good person." And you let the thought pass. The night unfolds differently because of that. You watch a show without half watching it. You don't draft imaginary texts in your head. You don't fall asleep rehearsing conversations. When you get into bed, your body feels heavier in the good way, the way it feels when it's finally allowed to rest. Nothing about this night was dramatic. And that's the point. You didn't control anyone else's emotions. You didn't fix disappointment. You didn't become cold or distant. You stayed present. You stayed clear. You stayed in your own lane. And because of that, you didn't lose your Friday night to someone else's mood. This is what it looks like when boundaries stop being theory and start being lived. Not in big confrontations. Not in speeches. But in small, ordinary moments where the old pattern almost takes over and doesn't. You go to sleep knowing something important has shifted. Not because everyone was happy, but because you didn't abandon yourself to make that happen. Section 10. What this episode was really about is learning how to stop confusing emotional pressure with personal responsibility. Reacting is fast, automatic, and driven by guilt and urgency. Responding is slower, chosen, and grounded in judgment. The goal was never to control how other people feel or to make sure no one is ever disappointed. The goal was to stop handing over your calm, your time, and your self-respect the moment emotional tension appears, so you can live with less weight on your shoulders. First, we named the real problem. You've been carrying other people's emotions as if they were your job, often without realizing it. Then we slowed everything down by separating guilt from action, so guilt stopped behaving like a command and became just another sensation you could feel without obeying. Next, you learned how overexplaining quietly erodes boundaries, and how a simple, complete sentence can end negotiations before they start. After that, we practiced staying steady when disappointment shows up, instead of rushing to soothe it and accidentally teaching others that your limits can be moved with emotion. Then we looked at what happens after the conversation ends, and how to close it internally so it doesn't keep replaying in your mind and draining the rest of your day. From there, you stepped out of old roles, fixer, peacemaker, responsible one, by simply refusing to perform them, without confrontation or announcements. You saw how guilt often returns later in disguise, asking you to renegotiate days after the fact, and how letting guilt exist without acting on it is what finally allows boundaries to settle. And finally, you learned how to practice empathy without emotional responsibility, so you can stay warm, present, and human without absorbing or managing what belongs to someone else. We brought all of this together in that Friday night moment, where the old pattern almost took over, and instead you stayed grounded, clear, and intact. At the core, this lesson wasn't about becoming tougher or more distant. It was about becoming cleaner. Clean boundaries don't require drama. They don't require speeches. They don't require emotional withdrawal. They require clarity and the willingness to tolerate a little discomfort without fixing it. When you stop reacting automatically, you don't lose your kindness, you regain your choice. And choice is what makes kindness sustainable instead of exhausting. Here are 3 things to do today so this actually changes how you live. First, before responding to any message or conversation that carries emotional weight, insert a pause on purpose. That might be 5 minutes, one slow breath, or simply putting the phone down and reminding yourself that feelings don't get to decide your behavior. Second, choose one boundary sentence you've been overexplaining and use it once today without adding justification, even if your body feels uneasy afterward. Let the discomfort be there without rushing to repair it. Third, tonight, when a conversation tries to replay in your head, use a clear internal closing line like "this is over now," and deliberately return your attention to what's physically in front of you instead of letting the loop run. As you practice this, you may notice something subtle but important. Your life doesn't get quieter because everyone around you suddenly behaves better. It gets quieter because you stop responding to every emotional ripple as if it's an emergency. You begin to trust yourself to handle discomfort without collapsing into old habits. And over time, that trust becomes a steady background feeling, a sense that you can be in the presence of tension without losing yourself. If this lesson resonated, the next one to watch is about emotional detachment versus emotional control, how to stop overinvesting emotionally without becoming numb, avoidant, or shut down, because that's the confusion that often shows up right after people start setting real boundaries. If you want a whole library of Stoic Focus lessons on emotional control, boundaries, and relationships, built to help you live lighter without becoming colder, this is what we do here every week. If you feel messages like this need to reach more people, hit like, tap subscribe, and share your thoughts in the comments.